The dark side of spirituality and sexuality on today's Oblyron Spirituality. Greetings everyone, I'm Oblyron, Lord of the Underworld and consort to the most lovely Hecate. Thank you for joining me on today's episode where we are going to talk about the dark side of spirituality and sexuality and how these energies can create cults which lead to the exploitation of its members. Krishnamurti said, "Do not follow anyone and don't join a group." And I agree with him 110%. In fact, I'm a little bit of a hypocrite because of this channel that I do, as well as having, a Discord server. But he's absolutely right. In my own personal spiritual seeking, I have went out to explore, alternative practices. I went out to explore, trying to find meaning in my life. And I found that as I reached out, many of these organizations and many of these groups are actually indoctrination into cults. And many of these types of classes and whatnot are really just stepping stones where they take spiritual energy and they basically manipulate people in vulnerable states. I mean, a lot of people can complain about going to church and think that it's boring or whatnot, but really church is safe. As a musician, I've played many church services, and I actually quite enjoy playing Catholic Mass. And I find that, like I said, church is a very safe space. When you go into these alternative practices, you go into these alternative spiritual classes or New Age classes, you don't know what you're getting. You don't know who the founder of that practice is, and you're basically going in blind. So if any of you out there do choose to explore these types of alternative options, make sure to research wherever you're going very good, because, like I said, you just don't know what you're getting yourself into. And I've had several experiences like this, and it's kind of led me to believe, well, is everything just an indoctrination into a cult? I can't say for certain, but so far it's really not looking good in terms of experiencing a class or a practice which is completely altruistic in nature. So case in point, I was taking a spiritual class some 15 years ago, and I was seeking at the time, and also at that time, I was in a particularly vulnerable state of my life, which many people are when they do seek out these types of classes. I was in a particularly vulnerable state of my life. I knew I had to improve. I knew I had to pull my head out of my ass or whatever you want to call it. And so I had sought these classes out. And it was sort of a new agey spiritual class, dealt with chakras, dealt with the whole love and light philosophy. And I was doing this group exercise. There were 4 of us in the class. I was the only guy in the class, and we were sitting in a circle, and we were basically opening up our chakras. We were activating our Kundalini. And this was a beginning class. So, we're all sitting, group meditating, envisioning the chakras. And at the end of the exercise, we're all kind of looking at each other a little bit awkwardly. And later on I'd realize, well, it's because they were all thinking the same thing I was thinking, which is, why do I want to rip all your clothes off right now? And that, it may sound funny, but it's actually really not. When you're engaged in awakening your Kundalini, when you are engaged in opening up your chakras, the sacral chakra, the sexual chakra, is one of the chakras that gets activated. And if you're not aware of this, you will release these sort of repressed or hidden sexual energies. And you take a group class and everyone's doing the same thing. Well, those energies get amplified. And nowhere in the explanation of the exercise was that ever explained. I had to figure this out, years later when I tried to when I was piecing together what I experienced. And so again, when you engage in these group exercises, there's all these emotions flowing. There's a Kundalini activation. You're in a very vulnerable state. You're essentially have gone through this sort of spiritual orgasm, and you're surrounded with other people. And so you're in this particularly vulnerable state, and emotionally vulnerable, and it's also the same type of vulnerability as, let's say, after an intimate experience. And it was during this phase that we had, I should say, the instructor put on videos of the founder of this particular healing modality, is what they called it. We were watching videos of the founder, and we were repeating these mantras of unconditional love and love and light while we were watching videos of the founder. Now, some of you out there have probably kind of put it together. It's like, well, that sounds pretty sus. You're in this emotionally vulnerable state. You're repeating mantras of love and light, and you're watching videos of a founder. Like, that is a recipe for a slow indoctrination into a cult. And of course, it was never advertised as being a cult. It was never advertised as being anything other than a spiritual class. And why would they advertise it as being anything other than a spiritual class? Because no one gets indoctrinated into a cult by their own free will. They have to be tricked into doing this. And one of those ways is by taking these concepts, taking these traditions, which are normally taught by a guru, a certified guru, or an actual wise person, but then they get twisted by people who know how to manipulate these energies, and they turn it into something to where now they place themselves as the head figure. As I was experiencing that, I noticed I started to become sort of infatuated with this founder whom I had never met, and it took about a good, I would say, maybe 6 months to kind of shake myself of that, for me to kind of really get my head back on straight. And I had never asked for that. I wanted to take a class to understand myself better, to understand the world around me better, to understand people better. And yet, the experience turned into something which was quite manipulative. Now, did that founder of the practice know what they were doing? What was it completely innocent? No, there's absolutely no way. Especially knowing the things that I know now, a lot of that was very intentional. A lot of it was, it came under the guise of love and light. It came under the facade of, take this spiritual class, you're going to expand your mind or whatnot. But, this has been kind of my experience when I have went out and sought other classes. I don't know if any of you have experienced these types of things. Please leave a comment. I know I'm not the only one. I know a lot of people go through this, and many times we may feel ashamed to talk about it, but those types of organizations are out there. And this is why, as I've explored more of these sort of alternative practices, why I actually find myself kind of siding with a lot of the traditionalists. There are many people in the Hindu tradition who say, your spiritual experience should be a personal experience. It should be something that you essentially practice in your bedroom, unless you're under, a true master. And I completely agree with that. Because again, when you activate your chakras, there are so many emotions, there are so many things that happen to your body physiologically that is not really mentioned. And even in a lot of YouTube videos that I see, I don't see a lot of people talking about this. I don't know if it's because of our puritanical origins that we are afraid to talk about, throwing in sexuality with spirituality. But, it's out there. Again, the sexual chakra, the sacral chakra, is one of the chakras that gets activated. And, if you're doing it right, you will experience, like I said, that sort of spiritual orgasm which puts you in a vulnerable state. I have also seen, this practice of chakra opening, of Kundalini activation, be used in several cult documentaries I've witnessed. It always seems like this is a very common pattern. People who are already in a particularly vulnerable state, they go to some spiritual leader, they want help with their lives, and that leader essentially indoctrinates them into their practice. They say it's interfaith. They say everyone is welcome here, but that's really just the facade to get people to come in. I've been to a couple of these organizations that say, we welcome everyone. Well, of course they welcome everyone because they eventually want to convert you to their beliefs and their thoughts. And generally speaking, when people subject themselves to a cult, the next thing that happens after they start to lose their sense of individuality, or they experience that emotional vulnerability, is depending on how close they get to that spiritual leader, many times that spiritual leader is exploiting their followers, either monetarily, either sexually, and many of the times it depends on the sexual orientation of that cult leader. A lot of these cult leaders are men, and a lot of cult leaders are heterosexual men. So it's generally women who get exploited the most. In certain instances where I think I saw this one documentary where the cult leader was homosexual, he was abusing the men. And in other cases, like let's say with Heaven's Gate, that particular cult, I believe John Doe, the cult leader, he was either repressed homosexually or he was even asexual. And his followers, his male followers, were castrating themselves to basically be like the cult leader, to model their behavior after the cult leader. So all this spiritual energy that's generated in these classes, that's generated when you're with other people, it's very powerful. And if you're not wise or not aware of what these energies can actually do, it can really open yourself up to a world of hurt and a world of manipulation. And it's really unfortunate that this does happen, and it continues to happen to this day. So, if you're going to go to these types of energy, these group energy classes, always be aware. Always go up with your defenses up. I hate to say it, but, just because someone is coming to you under the guise of love and light, or, you know, just because you see all these rainbow patterns in drawings on the wall and, you know, it all looks light and fluffy, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily safe. Many times it's actually it's actually one of the most manipulative tactics that you can actually experience. And, you know, this is coming from a guy who calls himself the Lord of the Underworld. But, you know, it's very true, because it's my job to see the shadow. It's my job to expose the shadow. I've gone through the crucible of exploring my own shadow, and, you know, this is what I found. This has been my experiences. So, again, just be very careful. Not everything out there is as it appears to be. And, you know, just take care, especially if you're going to bring other people into the mix, or, you know, if you're going to bring your family into the mix or any of that kind of stuff. You know, make sure to really research thoroughly what you're getting yourself into. You know, the internet is a wonderful source of information these days, and you can find anything on anyone. So if you find any red flags on any of those practices, you know, be sure to go with your gut instinct. So if any of you have resonated with this, please leave a comment. I think it's very important to get the dialogue going on these types of experiences, because so many of these things get brushed under the rug. And again, thank you all for your continued support. I noticed there's been a lot of new subscribers. I welcome you all, and for everyone who's been hanging around since last year, thank you again too. I appreciate each and every one of you, and love and light and wisdom and shadow. And we shall now close with the chant of Oblyron. Amde sote, amde Oblyron, amde sote, amde Oblyron.